Good day to you. And so here we are in our final instructor video, trying to wrap things up, trying to get an understanding of what we've just been through for 15 weeks studying media systems. And we do know that the world is a huge place, right? We started out with reminding ourselves about that 200 countries in the world, having to fly for 48 hours straight if you want to go all the way around the world, having all kinds of languages out there, the biggest one of which is Chinese, followed by Spanish, followed by English. And we know that within this context, there are strong forces of globalization going on in the world that started centuries ago, but are really accelerating now, propelling countries and companies and individuals and media content into closer unions with each other across the world. And that this globalization that's taking place is largely due to marketplace factors or economic factors, or striving for profitability is what companies are doing in exploring new business ventures with their media products in overseas markets that are just contributing to globalization. And we know that each country has a certain culture to it, that this culture is likened to the ground in which a tree grows, and that the culture of a country is dependent upon the history of the country and the society that the country has within its borders and the government system and other unique attributes about people. And that this then leads to a kind of philosophy that a country can have, represented by roots in the soil system of a tree. And the philosophy has a particular viewpoint of how a media system should grow up in a country, what it should look like, what its purpose should be, other than just existing, other than just being allowed to grow on its own. And that these philosophies lead to regulation of media, mostly broadcast media, not so much print media, although we do find that in the communist countries like China and other countries as well that are war-torn. But we know that we're popping out of the ground now into the trunk of the tree when we're looking at regulations as those items that hold up the tree and give it its basic structure. And from there, we know that we go on to financing, and that financing is a big important factor for the shape of the content, because whoever pays for the content is going to want to have an influence over the content, whether that's advertisers or government or bribes or donators. Those people want to have a say over the content. So if you follow the money in broadcasting, you can also learn where the content comes from. And those are bigger branches that are sprouting off of the tree trunk into the smaller branches, which then become accessibility of the media system. And this is how easy it is to get access to certain media content. Do you have to pay for it? Do you have to travel for it? Do you need to be a certain age to look at the media content? Do you have to have a certain technology in your house for the content? Excuse me. Do you have to do anything to go out of your way to get to that content, or is that content just simply there for you by virtue of the paths that you take in your daily routine? That's what accessibility is all about. And from accessibility, we finally arrive at the content of a media system, the part of the tree that we see, the leaves that are just coming out now in the spring. Those leaves are going to dominate our focus when we look at trees, and content dominates the focus when we look at media systems, although as we've learned all class long, we're digging deeper and going beyond just the content to study what is behind the content. Nevertheless, the content is the leaves on the tree, and that there are certain leaves which represent the health of the tree or the health of the media system, and that's the news reporting dimension of content that we took a look at in this class, and that's going to be those leaves that are shiny or have a different color. And then from the news content, we went on to studying media imports and exports, or the seeds of a tree. And those are those media content products and services and formats, as is in the case of radio, that go from one country to another country and are adopted in other countries. And they fit in with the notion of cultural imperialism that we talked about earlier, where media products bring into a country a certain lifestyle that can be adopted by the indigenous peoples of that country. Lifestyles about eating, lifestyles about clothes, lifestyles about how you use your time. So media imports and exports then led to the next part of the tree that we just studied this week, and that's the media audience. It's actually the people that pass by the tree and get access to those leaves and end up consuming media content. And that takes us now to our concluding chapter, where we try to draw some big picture items. And the first item that we want to take a look at is the dimension that we've been studying, though not so overtly, all semester long, is the dimension between public media and private media. And we do know that when you have private media combined with profitability, that you are going to get media products that are not necessarily in the best interest of the audience, but are still trying to capture the audience's attention, spike the ratings, so to speak, so that then those ratings can fetch more advertising dollars. And so a lot of our content in the United States, which is derived from this kind of a private model, is not necessarily in our best interest, but is just trying to entertain us. It's trying to, it can debase us, right? We can be really interested in people's affairs or people getting kicked off The Bachelor or Survivor or whatever, but is it doing anything for us intellectually? Is it doing anything for us culturally? It doesn't really matter. We're looking to be diverted, and profitable private media content serves that purpose very well. On the other hand, public content has a different purpose. It's trying to serve the public for the public's own good. It's trying to let them know that there's going to be a big storm coming in. It's trying to let the public know that a new park is being built in a neighborhood. It's trying to make sure that everybody has access to news, even if you live way out in the middle of a cornfield in Iowa. That's what public service media have as their focus. And therefore, they're not trying to sell you something. They're trying to communicate something that somebody, usually a government appointed person or a government regulator or a government affiliated person, somebody has decided is in your best interest. Whether it is in the best interest of you or not, that's up for you to decide. But there's a very different dimension and outcome between public and private media. And then a second issue that we have to study is this whole violence and sexuality issue. And we can see a kind of inversion taking place between these two items, violence and sexuality, when we look at Europe, and specifically France, Britain, and the UK versus the US. And we can see that in Europe, violence is something that is shunned or frowned upon, particularly in Sweden, that it's downplayed, that they're really trying, the media producers and regulators in Europe, trying to reduce violence in programming. And when violence is aired in media content in Europe, it's going to be in realistic violent situations, like a news report where somebody has been killed in a robbery, or a military strike that has taken the lives of people. That's where violence is seen as more appropriate in Europe. Whereas the other kind of violence that we'll have in cop shows or in films, that's downplayed. You can find it, but it's downplayed. In the United States, it's the opposite. We do stay away from how should we say, vivid violence in our news reports. If somebody is shot, we're only going to show the yellow tape. We're not going to show the body with blood like they do in Mexico. We won't do that. But we will show body with blood in a CSI crime show. So violence in the United States is okay in a fictional media content context, but not in an actual media content actual media content context. And the same goes with sexuality. It's also inverted. In Europe, you do find those countries much more open to sexuality in the media. That includes profanity, what we would call profanity. Remember, the British don't have a term for that. Intercourse, although without penetration, and nudity. We see those things on television, and we hear those kinds of things on radio and in newspapers even, when appropriate, within the context of a serious drama, for example. But we don't see those kinds of things teased at us. And that's what we can see in the United States. We can see being teased about sexuality with shock jocks and with about Jerry Springer and bleeping out words that are said. But we don't see nudity and sexuality because it's prohibited. It's prohibited very strongly by the FCC. And the last item that I want to talk about has to do with this idea of whether what you end up viewing or watching or reading or listening to as a media property is seen as a product or a service or propaganda. Because all three can really be interchangeable, and they can also be seen as equal to each other. So let's take the first one. If you are watching a news program and it is a product, right? It is a packaged product that is going to contain advertisements that is for sale. It's being marketed to you. And so it has dimensions to it that are going to be eye candy to it, with the graphics and with the kinds of stories that are offered. This one's about fire. Check it out, a story about a house on fire. That's something you want to hear, right? Those kinds of stories are going to be popular in a media system that has media content as a product, where advertising is embedded in that product, versus a service. When you have a service, a public service, it's like your utilities at home, right? You can't be denied electricity coming into your home. If you want it, you can have it because it is a public service. It's a public utility. And that's the same with media in those countries where you have the license fee. Those countries see media as a service, that it's something that everybody, by virtue of being a citizen in that country, has a right to access, and it should have information that educates people and builds them up and elevates their cultural tastes. Versus propaganda, the word that we use mostly in the Chinese context, which is to promote the goals of the Communist Party. That's what propaganda is all about. But when we here in the United States define propaganda, of course, we see it as a bad thing. We see it as somebody trying to manipulate us to believe in their ideology, which otherwise we wouldn't agree with. And so propaganda has a different meaning between the U.S. and China. But to finish on that note of the U.S. and China, of all the countries in the book, we can find a lot of similarities when it comes to their media systems, but particularly between China and the United States in terms of being insulated media systems that are consumed largely within the country and produced largely within each country. We found so many similarities, yet so many differences in the two societies. But what it comes down to is communism and is libertarianism combined with capitalism, are those two systems really any different in terms of controlling media content? That's a conclusion that I think that you will have to make, but we've made a lot of suggestions what some answers are in this course. And that's going to wrap up our final chapter. I hope you've enjoyed your stay in this class, and I hope to see you around in the Department of Communication. Have a great day.